Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling something that we all use every day. Probably don't think about it too much, though. Our memories. It's really incredible how much information our brains are able to retain over the long term. Childhood memories, complex ideas,
It truly is remarkable.
song lyrics.
Yeah,
It's just an incredible amount of information.
it is. And it's funny because like you said, we kind of take it for granted.
Right.
We don't really think about it. Yet, we've all had those kind of frustrating experiences of forgetting something simple.
Right.
Like, where did I put my keys?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
What was that person's name that I just met 2 minutes ago?
Yeah.
It's like our memory system has these baffling inconsistencies.
Yeah, exactly. And that paradox is what makes this deep dive so intriguing. So today we're going to explore a classic model of memory
Okay.
called the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. And this model attempts to explain how our brains store and retrieve information. Our sources include original research papers on some key memory experiments, as well as analyses of the model's strengths and limitations.
So before the Atkinson-Shiffrin model came along, scientists were already kind of grappling with some peculiar observations about memory.
Okay.
And these served as important clues in developing the model.
All right, so let's dive into those clues. What kind of observations were puzzling researchers back then?
Well, one of the biggest head scratchers was just the sheer speed of forgetting.
Hmm.
Think about the Brown-Peterson experiment.
Okay.
In this experiment, participants were given what are called consonant trigrams to remember. These are meaningless groups of 3 consonants, so like CHJ, for example.
HJ.
And they had to remember those for short periods of time. But there's a twist. They also had to count backwards by 3s during that short delay.
Okay.
So just to keep their minds busy.
Right. Seems simple enough, but I'm guessing the results were surprising.
Yeah, the findings were actually really shocking. After just 15 seconds
15 seconds.
of counting backwards, participants forgot those trigrams almost completely.
Wow. That makes forgetting a name after just meeting someone seem like a minor blip.
Yeah, it really does put into perspective how fragile new memories can be. That everyday experience we've all had. You meet someone, hear their name, and then it's just gone.
Poof.
The Brown-Peterson experiment helped to quantify that phenomenon.
Okay, so rapid forgetting was one puzzle piece. What else?
Another piece of the puzzle was this discovery of what's called memory span.
Okay.
This refers to the limit of how much information we can hold in mind at any given time, and the magic number is 7 plus or minus 2.
Ah, yes, the classic magical number 7. So it's easy enough to remember a short string of numbers like a phone number, but anything longer than that, like 10 or 12 digits, it starts to become a real mental juggling act.
Exactly, and that limited capacity raised a big question for scientists. If our long-term memory is essentially limitless, capable of storing this vast amount of knowledge experiences across our lifetime,
Right.
why is there this bottleneck in the short term? Why only 7 plus or minus 2? It suggested that there must be different memory systems at play.
Okay, so we've got these two key observations, rapid forgetting and this very limited short-term memory capacity. And that's where the Atkinson-Shiffrin model comes in. It tries to provide a framework to explain these seemingly contradictory aspects of memory.
Precisely. And it became the dominant model for a very good reason. It offered a really elegant way to make sense of many seemingly disparate observations about memory.
Okay, so how does this model actually work? What's the basic architecture of the Atkinson-Shiffrin model?
Well, at its core, the model proposes that we have these 2 distinct memory stores.
Okay.
We have a short-term store, or STS, and a long-term store, or LTS. You could think of it as a 2-stage process.
2 stores. Interesting. Let's break that down a bit further. Tell me more about these short-term and long-term stores.
Okay, so the short-term store is kind of like your mental workspace. It's where you hold information temporarily. Things like, again, a phone number you just heard, or the main points of a conversation you're having right now.
Okay.
But there's a catch. This STS has a very limited capacity, and information decays rapidly unless we actively work to keep it there.
So it's kind of like a mental sticky note.
Yeah,
But the adhesive isn't very strong and things tend to fall off pretty quickly.
exactly.
Okay. And what about the long-term store?
So the long-term store is like a vast library.
Okay.
It's where we house all of our knowledge, our experiences, our memories that we've accumulated over a lifetime. It's more permanent, and it has a seemingly immense capacity, capable of storing information for years, even decades.
Okay, so that makes sense. But how does information go from that temporary sticky note of short-term memory to the more permanent library of long-term memory?
That's where the idea of transfer comes in. The model proposes that information can move from the short-term store to the long-term store, but this transfer isn't automatic.
Okay.
There are things that can influence this process,
Hmm.
making it more or less likely that information will make that crucial jump to long-term storage.
Interesting. So what kind of things can influence this transfer? Is it just a matter of chance, or can we actually do something to control this process?
This is where the Atkinson-Shiffrin model gets really interesting. It introduces this concept of control processes, and these are mental actions we can take to influence our memory.
Mental actions. Tell me more. What are some examples of these control processes?
Okay, well, one important control process is what we call coding, or to be more precise, recoding. And this is about actively changing how we mentally represent information. For example, let's say you're trying to remember the word elephant. Instead of just passively repeating the word elephant in your mind, you might form a vivid mental image of, a large gray elephant with big floppy ears.
So it's about going beyond just rote repetition and making the information more meaningful and memorable, kind of like creating our own personalized mental mnemonics.
Exactly. You're actively working with the information, making it stickier in that mental workspace of the short-term store. And another key control process is one that you're probably very familiar with, rehearsal.
Rehearsal. That sounds pretty straightforward. Is it just about repeating things over and over again?
Essentially, yes. By repeating information, we're essentially refreshing it in the short-term store, buying it more time. And this increases the chances that it'll be transferred over to the long-term memory.
Ah, so that explains why we instinctively repeat things to ourselves when we're trying to remember something. It's like we're giving that mental sticky note a fresh coat of adhesive to keep it from falling off.
I love that analogy. That's a great way to put it. And the Atkinson-Shiffrin model provides a clear explanation for why this very common tactic is so effective.
Okay, so this is starting to make sense. We've got our two memory stores, short-term and long-term. And these control processes, like coding and a rehearsal, that we can use to influence how information moves between them. But how does this model explain those initial puzzles we talked about, the rapid forgetting and the limited memory span?
Well, that's what's so elegant about the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. It provides a framework for understanding both of those phenomena and even more.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's start with rapid forgetting. How does the model explain those Brown-Peterson experiment results where people forgot those trigrams so quickly?
Remember that the short-term store decays really rapidly. The act of counting backwards in those experiments prevented participants from rehearsing the trigrams. So the information simply faded away from the short-term store before it had a chance to be transferred to the long-term store. It was like a mental distraction that disrupted the rehearsal process.
So the counting backwards essentially overloaded their mental workspace, preventing them from refreshing that mental sticky note, and poof, the information just vanished. Okay, that makes sense. Now, how about the limited memory span? How does the Atkinson-Shiffrin model account for that magic number 7?
The model proposes that we can only rehearse one item at a time in our short-term store. So imagine you're trying to remember a long list of numbers. You rehearse the first one, then the second, then the third. But as you're going down this list, the earlier numbers are starting to fade from short-term memory before you can circle back to them.
It's like trying to juggle too many balls at once. You can only keep so many in the air at any given time. If you add too many, some are bound to come crashing down.
That's an excellent analogy. The Atkinson-Shiffrin model, in essence, is providing a framework for understanding that juggling act of short-term memory. But it goes even further than just explaining these two specific phenomena.
Yeah.
It also helps us to understand another very interesting effect, the serial position effect.
The serial position effect. That's the one where we tend to remember the first and last items in a list better than those in the middle.
Precisely. And the Atkinson-Shiffrin model very elegantly explains both the primacy effect, remembering those first items, and the recency effect, remembering the last items in terms of how information is processed in those two memory stores.
Oh, very versatile model.
Yeah.
So let's start with the primacy effect. Why do we tend to remember those initial items on a list better? Does it have something to do with rehearsal?
You're on the right track.
Yeah.
Remember, rehearsal plays a key role in transferring information to long-term memory. So when you encounter the first item on a list, you have all of your rehearsal capacity dedicated to that one item. So it has a greater chance of being transferred to long-term storage. But then the second item comes along, and now you're trying to rehearse both the first and the second, and so on, down the list.
So it's almost like a hierarchy of attention. Those first few items on the list, they get the VIP treatment, while those in the middle get kind of stuck at the back of the line waiting for their turn for rehearsal time.
I like that visualization. That's good. But what about those last few items on the list? How does the model explain the recency effect? Why are those last items often so easy to recall?
Yeah, that's the part I've always found most curious. It's almost counterintuitive that we'd remember those last items so well when they've had the least amount of time in our minds.
Well, if you think about it from the perspective of the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, those last few items are still fresh in your short-term store when you're asked to recall the list. They're still readily accessible in that mental workspace.
Oh,
They haven't had time to fade away yet.
so it's like they're still sitting on that mental sticky note just waiting to be called upon. And as we move back through the list, those earlier items have had more time to decay, making them harder to access.
Precisely. The model predicts that people will tend to recall those last items first, simply because they're the most accessible. But as they go further back on the list, those earlier items become more and more difficult to retrieve.
It's amazing how this model provides a framework for understanding these subtle nuances of memory. But is it all just theory, or is there actual experimental evidence to support the idea that rehearsal is so critical for transferring information to long-term memory?
Oh, it's not just theory. There's actually a classic study by Rundus that provides compelling evidence for this. He had participants rehearse words aloud, and what he found was there was a remarkably strong correlation between the number of times a word was rehearsed and the likelihood of recalling it later. More rehearsal meant much higher chance of remembering.
That's fascinating. So it's not just a hunch. There's actual experimental data to back up this key aspect of the Atkinson-Shiffrin model.
Exactly. And while the Atkinson-Shiffrin model is a really great starting point for understanding memory, it's important to note that it's been refined and expanded upon over time.
Okay.
It's provided a foundation for decades of further research into the complexities of human memory.
That makes sense. Science is always pushing forward, building upon previous knowledge and refining our understanding of the world around us. So what are some of the ways in which our understanding of memory has evolved since the initial Atkinson-Shiffrin model? What new insights have emerged from subsequent research?
That's a great question, and that gets to the heart of how scientific progress really works. We start with a model that explains a lot, but then we dig deeper, asking new questions and uncovering new layers of complexity. And that's exactly what's happened with our understanding of memory.
This is all so intriguing. I can't wait to delve deeper into those refinements and new discoveries. So before the break, we were really getting acquainted with the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, this model that provided a groundbreaking framework for understanding how our memories work.
Yes. We explored its core components, the short-term store, that fleeting mental workspace, and the long-term store, that vast repository of knowledge and experiences. We also touched upon that ingenious concept of control processes like rehearsal, which we can use to manipulate and strengthen our memories.
Right. We saw how this model so elegantly explains some really key observations about memory. That fleeting nature of short-term memory, the limited capacity of what we can hold in our minds at any given moment, and even that peculiar phenomenon of remembering the first and last items on a list better than those stuck in the middle.
Precisely. But as with any scientific model, there's always room for refinement and expansion. What's so fascinating about the Atkinson-Shiffrin model is that it served as a springboard for decades of research, leading to a more nuanced and dynamic understanding of human memory.
And that's what I find so exciting about science, you know. It's a process of constant discovery and refinement. We build upon existing knowledge, challenge assumptions, and uncover new layers of complexity. So what are some of the ways in which our understanding of memory has evolved since that original Atkinson-Shiffrin model? Where did researchers start to maybe poke holes or see opportunities to expand the model?
One of the key areas where the model was refined was the very nature of the short-term store. The original model viewed it as somewhat passive, like a holding area where information either decayed or was transferred to long-term memory.
So kind of like a waiting room for memories?
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Okay. But I have a feeling it's not quite that simple.
You're right. Later research, particularly the work of Alan Baddeley, suggested that the short-term store is much more active and dynamic than initially proposed. He introduced this model of working memory, which really emphasizes the conscious, active processing of information.
Ah, working memory. I've heard that term before. It suggests that it's not just about holding information passively, but actually working with it, manipulating it, using it to solve problems and make decisions.
Exactly. Working memory is like our mental scratch pad. is where we hold and manipulate information to perform those complex cognitive tasks, crucial for things like reasoning, comprehension, learning.
So instead of just like passively repeating a phone number, I might actively chunk it into smaller, more meaningful units to help me remember it. Or if I'm trying to solve a math problem in my head, I'm holding those different parts of the equation in mind and actively manipulating them to come up with a solution.
Precisely. And Baddeley's model of working memory goes even further, proposing these distinct components within working memory itself, each responsible for different types of processing. So, for example, there's the phonological loop, which handles verbal information, the visual spatial sketchpad, which deals with visual and spatial information, and the central executive, which acts like a conductor, coordinating those different components.
So it's not just one big undifferentiated box. It's more like a team of specialists, each handling a specific type of information or task.
That's a great way to think about it. And this shift from a passive short-term store to an active working memory system really significantly impacted our understanding of memory and cognition.
Okay, that's fascinating. It seems like every new discovery opens up a whole new avenue for exploration. So we've talked about how our understanding of short-term memory has evolved. What about long-term memory? Has our understanding of that changed as well?
Absolutely. While the Atkinson-Shiffrin model focused primarily on the structure of memory, now those different stores, later research delved much deeper into the processes involved in long-term memory. So how do we encode information? How do we store it? And how do we retrieve it when we need it?
Encoding, storage, and retrieval, those are like the key stages of memory, right?
Exactly. Encoding is all about how we transform incoming information into a format that our brains can store. It's
Yeah.
like taking notes in our own unique mental language. Storage is the process of maintaining that information over time, kind of like filing those notes away in our mental library. And then retrieval is the ability to access and bring that information back into conscious awareness when we need it, sort of like searching for and finding the right file in our mental cabinets.
I love those analogies. They make the whole process so much more tangible. But I imagine each of those stages, encoding, storage, and retrieval, are influenced by a whole host of factors.
You're absolutely right. Let's take encoding, for instance. One crucial factor is the level of processing we engage in. The more deeply we process information, the more likely we are to remember it.
Deep processing, what does that actually entail? What does it mean to process information deeply?
It means going beyond simply noticing superficial features and truly grappling with the meaning and significance of the information. So, for instance, if you're trying to remember a new word, you could simply repeat it over and over again, which is a pretty shallow level of processing. Or you could think about its definition, create a mental image that represents that word, or connect it to other words and concepts you already know. These are all examples of deeper processing.
So it's about engaging more of my brain, making connections, weaving that new information into my existing web of knowledge. Not just passively absorbing it, but actively wrestling with it.
Exactly. And research has shown that this kind of deep, meaningful processing results in much stronger and longer-lasting memories. It's like the difference between skimming a book and truly immersing yourself in it, thinking critically about the ideas and relating them to your own life.
That makes perfect sense. It's like planting a seed. The more care and attention you give it, the stronger and more resilient it will grow. So deep processing is key for encoding. Are there similar factors that influence the storage and retrieval stages of memory?
Absolutely. The way we store information can be influenced by things like our emotional state, our existing knowledge base, even our physical environment. And when it comes to retrieval, there are certain strategies and techniques that can make it easier to access those memories tucked away in our mental archives.
This is all so incredibly helpful. I feel like I'm already starting to think differently about how I approach learning and remembering. But before we dive into those storage and retrieval strategies, I think it's time for us to wrap up part 2 of this deep dive into memory. Welcome back to our deep dive into memory. We've been on this journey exploring the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, a classic model that's given us a foundation for understanding how our minds store and retrieve information.
It really has been fascinating to trace how this model evolved, from those early observations about rapid forgetting
Yeah.
and the limited capacity of short-term memory. And we've seen how those initial insights paved the way for a much more nuanced understanding of those different stages of memory, encoding,
Yeah.
storage,
Yeah.
and retrieval.
Exactly. We also talked about how the concept of the short-term store was refined into that more dynamic model of working memory, where information isn't just passively held, but actively processed and manipulated. But as we wrap up our deep dive, I'd love to touch on one question that I think a lot of us ponder. Why do some memories linger for years, even decades, while others fade away so quickly?
That is a question that has intrigued memory researchers for ages. What makes some memories stick while others just vanish? It is a complex issue, but research suggests that a few key factors played a really significant role. One of the most powerful is emotional significance.
So the memories that are tied to strong emotions, whether positive or negative, tend to be more vivid and enduring.
Exactly. Think about some of your most powerful memories. They're likely to be events that evoked intense emotions. Perhaps a wedding, a
Mhm.
graduation, the birth of a child, or even a time of great loss or trauma.
Yeah.
These emotionally charged experiences tend to leave a much deeper imprint on our brains.
It makes sense. It's like our brains have a way of prioritizing those memories that are, most critical to our survival and well-being. If a memory is linked to a strong emotional response, it's kind of like a sign that, hey, you need to pay attention and remember this. It could be something positive that we want to repeat or something negative that we want to avoid in the future.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this connection between emotion and memory has been confirmed in numerous studies. Researchers have found that people are much better at remembering words or images that are paired with emotionally arousing stimuli, like maybe a sudden loud noise
Okay.
or a disturbing image.
So it's not just about the event itself, but the emotional context that surrounds it. Like that emotion acts almost like a mental highlighter. It makes those experiences stand out and stick in our memories more readily.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just emotion that plays a role. The way we encode information, the level of processing we engage in, also has a huge impact on memory durability.
Right. And we talked about how deeper processing leads to stronger memories. It's the difference between passively absorbing information and really actively engaging with it, making those connections and thinking critically about the material.
Exactly. And there's another critical factor that contributes to the formation of robust, long-lasting memories: repetition and practice.
Ah, the power of practice.
Mhm.
We all know that if we want to learn a new skill or a language or a piece of music, we have to practice regularly. And it seems like that same principle applies to memory. The more we revisit a memory, the stronger it becomes.
Precisely. Each time we recall a memory, we're reactivating those neural pathways. And that strengthens those connections between neurons. It's kind of like walking along a path in the woods. The more you walk that path, the clearer and more well-defined it becomes.
And I imagine the opposite is also true. If we don't revisit a memory, if we don't actively recall it, those neural pathways start to weaken and that memory becomes more and more difficult to access. Like that path in the woods, it becomes overgrown and eventually just fades away.
Exactly. So if you want to remember something important, make a conscious effort to actively recall it regularly. Talk about it with friends, write about it in a journal, create a mental image, or just find some other way to bring that memory back to mind.
Yep.
That kind of active recall helps to solidify the memory and make it much more resistant to just fading away.
So helpful. This has all been so incredibly helpful. It really underscores the fact that we have a lot more control over our memories than we might realize.
I completely agree. Understanding how memory works,
Yeah.
those factors that influence encoding, storage, and retrieval really empowers us to improve our ability to learn, remember, and make sense of the world around us.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a sense of awe at the intricate workings of the human mind. It really is a complex and remarkable system.
It truly is. And the more we learn about it, the more we realize just how much more there is to discover.
That's what makes this journey of exploration so captivating, right? There's always something new to learn, a new mystery to unravel. And who knows what incredible insights await us as we continue to delve deeper into those inner workings of our minds. This deep dive into memory models has given us a great foundation to build on, but it's really just the beginning. There are so many other fascinating aspects of memory to explore. Maybe in a future deep dive, we can delve into the differences between explicit and implicit memory, or perhaps explore the role of memory in shaping our personal identities. Until then, keep those minds curious and those memories sharp.